Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. It's true what they say, that the older you get, the faster time goes. It's also true, however, that describes a subjective experience, because it's objectively true that we're all growing old at the same speed. Every single one of us, as long as we're alive, will age 1 year every time Earth makes a trip around the sun. But there are changes that come to pass. We do, over time, begin to feel the weight of the years. We grow old, which is a constant reminder that death is in our future. We grow weary because our bodies begin to break down. We have pains and aches. We have regrets. But we're also growing young. Every day older I get is a day I get closer to having no more body pains, to having no more regrets, to having no more breaking down. Isn't that something? We feel like we're growing older when we're actually growing younger. I wonder what would happen if I could get my heart to believe what my mind knows. If I could wake up each day with that joy, that certainty that I am another day closer to seeing the living God. I'm another day closer to dancing with my Lord. I'm another day closer to putting behind me everything that weighs me down, and perhaps better still, putting behind me everything that displeases my Lord. Every day I grow closer to what I'm going to be. Now, I admit, to be sure, that last step is a doozy. That at the moment I die, the gap, the immeasurable gap between what I was the instant before and what I will be the instant after is huge. And that every step that I take every day on this earth is tiny. But it's still going in the right direction. It's still getting me closer. I'm still going where I'm supposed to be going. I'm not getting old, I'm getting better. I'm not getting old, I'm getting younger. Some time ago, I went well past balding and entered into bald. And sometime soon, I'll leave aging and get to aged. I'm a grandfather. And I will tell you, for those of you who are younger than me, you've heard it before, but it's absolutely true. There's never a switch. There's never a moment where you feel older internally than you used to feel. the identity that I have with 50-year-old me and 40-year-old me, all the way down to 10-year-old me. That's all me. That's one guy. And the same will be true when I'm dead. It'll still be me. Isn't that a glorious thought? That again, even though the change is so big, even though the change is so huge, even though the change is so sudden, when we walk through the veil, it's we who walks through it. We're still us. There's a continuity of consciousness, a continuity of personhood. I will still be me, but I will be my best me. And I will have my best life then. I think it's a good and healthy thing for us to contemplate the reality of our aging and the reality of death's certain presence in our future. In fact, the Word of God tells us, Lord, teach me to number my days. But it also tells us that He has numbered them. And nothing we can do can add or subtract to that number. So feel like you're growing old? Be at peace. Because peace is what you're getting closer to each and every day. Jesus has begun a good work in me. And He is faithful and true to carry it through to the end. I mentioned before that the Westminster divines were careful to break down for us in manageable bite-sized pieces their understanding of what God was saying to us in and through the Ten Commandments. And as we have spent a few segments now looking at the first commandment, I have been desperately trying not to step on the toes of this particular question, because I think it's not only important, I think it's insightful and revealing of what we are. When we come now to question 48, we read this: what are specially taught by these words before me in the first commandment? What are we specially taught by these words before me in the first commandment? This is in reference to the beginning in the first commandment, where God says, "You shall have no other gods before me." And this is how the divines answer. These words, "before me," in the first commandment teach us that God, who sees all things, takes notice of, and is much displeased with, the sin of having any other God. What our divines are telling us here is what we should have known all along, that our first naturally, or at least sinfully natured attempt to weasel out of the plain intent of this command isn't going to work. You know, there are times when we're reading in our Bibles that we may get our hopes up because there's some sort of promise, and then the next thing you know, there's a condition on the promise, a string attached, and we realize, oh, we just missed out on this promise. Well, it works in reverse as well, where you get this warning, you get this description of here's something you're not supposed to do. And just like the lawyer who asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" just before Jesus broke into the Good Samaritan parable. So when we come to this, we think, oh, well, here's my way of escape. Here's my way to kid myself into thinking I'm keeping this commandment, because it says no other gods before me. Well, that before me, and this is what the divines are saying, that before me isn't a description of a list. It's a description of where these other gods may not be. They may not be in God's presence. They may not be in his purview. They may not be in his sight. And because God is present everywhere and God sees everything and his purview is all things, that must mean we can't have them anywhere. You know, there is a long history of what might be called the fallacy of emphasis, where we take a simple sentence that says something like this: you should not steal your neighbor's car. And we should know what that means. But if we say it this way, you should not steal your neighbor's car, someone might suggest that we're affirming that someone else has the authority to steal your neighbor's car. If we say you should not steal your neighbor's car, we are implicitly suggesting that you might do it anyway. If we say you should not steal your neighbor's car, or you should not steal your neighbor's car, the implication is, but you can, smash it up with a sledgehammer. Or you should not steal your neighbor's car, but, if you want to cross town, you could steal someone's car over there. Or you should not steal your neighbor's car, but you can certainly steal his motorcycle or his lawnmower. Well, that's the kind of way, we try to weasel out from under this command. Oh, well, I have other gods, sure, but they're not before God. God, you're number one on my list. You're my favorite. You're tops with me. Do I care too much about money? Of course I do. But there's no sweat here, no problem here, because I care about you more. Do I care too much about this or that, my reputation? Do I care too much about my success? Do I care too much about my emotional well-being? All of these things are idols, but Lord, they're not more important to me than you are, and so we're good on this first commandment, right? Wrong. We're not good. We're guilty. Because whatever idol we may have, whatever other God, you need to understand this. That for God to be our God, it doesn't mean that he's got 51% of what we think is important and everything else comes short at 49%. Everything that we love, if we would love rightly, has to be loved in the context of God himself. It's not a list where we love God the most and then we, separate from our love for God, love these other things. Every other thing that we love must be loved as a means to the end of loving the living God. It's not a list, it's Russian nesting dolls. Anytime anything drives us or motivates us, ultimately, that's apart from who God is, we're out of line and we've not kept this commandment, which means every day we don't keep this commandment. We come now to 2 Chronicles in our ongoing series that we call The Bible in 5 Minutes. The truth is, of course, I don't give you a summary of the Bible in 5 minutes. I do give you a summary of each of the books of the Bible in something approximating 5 minutes. Well, when we come to 2 Chronicles, we need to remember, first of all, that this is written at the same time as 1 Chronicles, which is not very contemporaneous with the events that are described. Rather, the chronicler is likely to be a writer who is writing in the post-exilic time period, that after Judah was conquered by Babylon and dragged into exile. And after Cyrus allows them to return, as we'll learn more about when we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, then comes the chronicler to write the story again, beginning with the reign of Solomon and leading to that particular exile, with a special focus, much greater focus on what's going on in Judah compared to what's going on in the northern kingdom of Israel. And what we see in Judah is a long-term downward trend with occasional upward spikes. If you were to sort of measure the moral character of Israel over this same time period, you'd have a graph that was pretty much straight downward. But with Judah, it's a little bit more complicated, a little bit more like a typical stock chart where there is a definite downward trend. But as I say, occasional moments of upticks through things like Josiah and the discovery of the law in the temple, or the ministry of Hezekiah, and several other godly kings who ruled, not the least of which, of course, would be Solomon at the beginning of 2 Chronicles. I've said it before and I'll say it again. We have a propensity because Jesus is called the son of David, because David has so much ink. We have a propensity to think of the rule of David as the pinnacle of God's kingdom on earth, in the context of Israel. But I would argue that things were even better under Solomon. There was greater peace, there was greater stability, there was greater wealth, there was greater national prominence, and all of those things are covered in the early parts of Chronicles. But the thing I love best about it, the scene that captures my heart, is after Solomon has finished following God's instructions in the construction of the temple, and as worship is about to commence in the temple, the glory cloud descends in the temple. It's like a time machine. It's like going back to the Exodus, when God in his presence was visceral and able to be smelled and tasted and touched. And so now this cloud comes and fills the temple, a miraculous demonstration of the reality of God's presence with his people. That's a glorious moment, because of course at the end of the day, things like peace or expanded territory or great wealth or great standing on the world stage, they're just nothing compared to the blessing of God's presence. And in fact, what we see in the book of Chronicles is precisely, writ large, that cycle that we've talked about so many times before. They've reached this pinnacle under Solomon. God has been their blessing and their presence, and things begin to go downhill when they forget that. And they forget, and they forget, and God sends them prophets to remind them, and they forget. And God sends them good kings to bring them to repentance, and they forget. And God gives them the example of Israel being taken into exile first. But they still forget, until finally they're brought into exile. But 2 Chronicles ends with the promise of Cyrus to send the people back, to restore the walls of Jerusalem, to restore the temple itself and rebuild it. Because that's what God is. God is gracious. The chronicler is reciting for us the story of our unfaithfulness and God's ongoing, patient faithfulness. That ongoing faithfulness does not mean no exile. It does not mean no hardship. In fact, it means faithfulness coming through those things so that God's people would remember that He is their blessing. Now that's the lesson we're supposed to learn too. Wherever we are in our spiritual walk, wherever we think things are at our local church, wherever we think we are culturally speaking, we need to remember that every blessing we have comes from God, that what matters is His presence with us, that even if we are walking through the valley of the shadow of death, if He is with us, we have nothing to fear. He is good, and He loves us. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.